This last month and a half has been a lot of me working on a Dungeons and Dragons adventure or campaign that I wrote for my birthday. In years past, I've talked about wanting to make my friends and family get together and play Dungeons and Dragons with me. Usually I back out because I figure no one actually wants to play. This time my wife took me seriously. I know, I haven't done many updates to this blog in a while, and the Dungeons and Dragons campaign is not the only writing I've been working on. My goal for the year was simply to write more. I have achieved that, and I've been consistent in writing every single day. Whether it's writing a legal pleading or working up and formatting a draft of a brief for work, or just an entry in my journal or daily notes. This has been the most prolific year of writing for me in a very long time, probably since the semester in college where I had both political science and world literature back to back. You may see me casually use the terms D&D, Dungeons and Dragons, and Pathfinder interchangeably. Without getting into all of the details about the different versions or editions of Dungeons and Dragons, any casual observer would not be able to tell the difference between any of the various editions. So with that in mind, I would say that my favorite version of Dungeons and Dragons is Pathfinder. The first edition of Pathfinder is effectively an unofficial 4th edition or a continuation of the 3.5 edition of the rules, and probably more like a 3.75 edition. My evidence is the fact that Monty Cook, one of the authors who worked on the official 3rd edition of Dungeons and Dragons, wrote the introduction for the 1st edition of the Pathfinder core rulebook. Turns out that a month and a half of writing works out to approximately an 8-hour adventure. Even though I hadn't really wanted the adventure to be quite that long when I wrote it, I also did not want any of my players to be bored. And I didn't want to be grasping for straws or trying to come up with story content on the fly while we were playing. So I buckled down and started to come up with a story that I knew I was going to have fun writing. None of the people playing had ever played before, so it was imperative to ease them into the experience. This is Hooli. I had AI generate him. In fact, I had AI generate most of the assets that I used during the adventure. And I even asked each of the players to give me a prompt to describe their characters. Hotpot lets you select a style, so there's a way to control the visual tone enough to where you can generate several images, and they're mostly visually consistent with one another. And the things that it gave me which were off, I attempted to explain them away with in-game lore. For instance, I wanted Hooli to be entirely green. He is a half-orc after all, but alchemists are always using potions to change their appearances or alter their bodies in one fashion or another. So it's not inconsistent with the character that I've created, and it makes the piece much more fascinating. This guy here is Chonkobar, a loyal follower of Eomidi. He's an ancient halfling at 83, also a good friend to Hooli. Chonkobar was chosen as the executor of Hooli's estate. He meets the players at the docks of Freeport, and he can either be taken along with the party for his useful abilities as a cleric, or simply be used as a guide to answer questions about the world around the players. Originally, I started to build a random generation engine whereby I would have a bunch of tables to consult depending on what the players wanted to do. The problem with players who haven't played before is that they don't know what they can and can't do. So there's a real problem with decision paralysis. Once the creative juices start flowing, it's a lot easier for players to start improving. So it was a mostly linear endeavor where the players are sort of funneled along down a predetermined story. I also didn't use the default setting of Galarian, the one provided by Paizo, the publishers of the Pathfinder core rulebook. Instead, I set the story mostly in Freeport, the City of Adventure, a phenomenal campaign book by Green Ronin Publishing. I told everyone that the session would be Lord of the Rings meets Pirates of the Caribbean. That wasn't entirely accurate. I leaned much more heavily into my experience with the Elder Scrolls and traditional D&D, where all the different races are much more commonplace. I feel like Tolkien fantasy relies too much on humans being the special ones. In my game, we didn't have a single player who was a human, so there were no human NPCs either. Once everyone was comfortable and we were done with the festival games, I introduced a natural disaster that sets up the main quest of having to track down an evil dwarven wizard who has captured a time dragon. Our evil wizard, Gracchus, lives in the dark lands or Underdark, and so the players need to get underground somehow. A sewer dungeon seemed the most plausible in a somewhat urban setting, and it works as a nice starter dungeon. Most of the monsters for that type of environment are pretty simple. Ghouls, goblins, rats, giant centipedes, and creatures of that nature. It isn't just any sewer though, it's a dwarven sewer, and the entrance to the place the players need to go is heavily guarded by 2 gargoyles, primarily to keep all the dangers that lie in the Underdark from wrecking the sewers. Dwarven magic was chosen because they're always the best stonemasons in any traditional fantasy setting. Also, gargoyles are protectors. Dwarven magic just works twice as good for these things, so the gargoyles try to prevent anything from entering or leaving. My wife and her sister came up with the idea to fashion a tripwire and use it on one of the gargoyles. That wasn't exactly what I had in mind, but the end result was the same. And that was about as far as we made it. Approximately 4 hours worth of gameplay. If anyone is interested, I'll be happy to post more of the adventure. But even running it just the one time, I saw tons of areas where I want to improve my notes and change subtle things. I also want to build in some optional stuff for more experienced groups to use. Overall, though, I think it was a success. If you liked this video, well, you know the drill.